Okay, so are we ready to go?
You're good to go.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Cassandra, for the introduction. Some of you have heard me talk before, and if you have, then great to have you back. And if you haven't, then I hope you enjoy what I'm going to talk about. Key West in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And that would be the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Not the last century, but 2 centuries ago. And I think you'll find that there's some interesting things to talk about here. And the topic then is change and then also revolution. Next slide. So here's what I want to talk about, my roadmap for today. Who was here in Key West? How did they live? What did they do? And then change in Key West. And I've picked out 3 factors: the immigration of Cubans to the island, to the city, African Americans in the city, and then the Great Fire of 1886. I might have picked out some others. For example, I'd certainly recommend to all of you that you read a wonderful book written by Arlo Haskell on the Jews of Key West. But I'm not going to cover that today. And again, Arlo has covered it very, very well. And then finally talking about the nest of revolution, Jose Marti and Cuba Libre, and then some quick comments at the end. Next slide. So again, as Cassandra said, don't wait till the end to ask questions. If there's anything you want to ask, just send it in through chat. So I like to always start out, before I talk about Key West, is talk about what it was like to live in the United States in this period. Next slide. So we take for granted that we have 50 states and that we are a union of 50 states. But if you look back here, and this is the period of the United States in 1870, so right after the Civil War, you can see that there's an unorganized territory, which should be familiar to you as today's Oklahoma. And then there are other territories out there that are organized, but not yet states that have been admitted to the Union. Next slide. So right after the Civil War, so if we start talking about the 1870s, that means the war had only been over 5 years when we get to 1870. There are 37 states in 1870 and 43 by 1890. And the reason I say that Florida, which is what we're going to talk about because this is where we are, is readmitted to the Union is because you'll remember that after the Civil War, the northern states, Congress, required all of the southern states that had been a part of the Confederacy to be reconstructed before they could be readmitted. So Florida's readmitted in June of 1868. And the other thing that everyone should remember, if we're talking about change that affects the 1870s, the 80s, and the 90s, is 3 very important amendments to the Constitution: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment is actually ratified in 1870. So these really have a huge impact on the country because the 13th Amendment frees forever African Americans who've been enslaved. The 14th Amendment provides that everyone who's born in this country is automatically a citizen. This is a classic case of the law of unintended consequences. The idea at the time was that if African Americans were going to be citizens, then we'd pass this amendment that said everyone born here was a citizen. But fast forward to today, we're not always so sure that we like this amendment. Are we all happy with the fact that everybody born here is automatically a citizen? Well, whether you are or not, this is one of the consequences of the 14th Amendment. If you know your history, by the way, the United States and maybe one or two other countries in the world are the only countries that provide that if you are born here, you are a citizen. And the 15th Amendment gives African Americans, men, the right to vote. So these are really, really important if we're talking about change in the 1870s and the 80s and 90s, because for the first time in American history, African Americans now begin, at least legally, to have the same rights as white citizens. The Southern economy was disrupted by war and the end of slavery. And then the other thing to think about after the Civil War, big picture, is we are in conflict with Native Americans. So we may have stopped fighting each other in the Civil War, but now you know your history, a lot of fight with Native Americans out on the frontier. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. So here's our population. In 1860, there had been about 31 million people living in the United States. Today, we have about 330 million. You know, we're in the middle of a census right now. And again, to circle back to my original point about the 14th Amendment, some of you probably followed this controversy about whether or not in the census this year that we should count people who are not citizens. But in any case, if you go back to 1870, 38 million in the country, 1880, about 50 million, and 1890, 63 million. So right there, if I tell you that we have 330 million people living here today, it was a very, very different America in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Next slide. And the American economy is really undergoing a huge transformation after the Civil War. I mean, this is the time when Edison invents his incandescent light, the light bulb, and Bell invents the telephone. And we have large-scale agriculture and the rise of labor unions and corporations and John D. Rockefeller and the Vanderbilts. And all this is a huge transformation in the American economy. Next slide. This is the sort of statistic that I love to see. Rent for a small house, $4.50 a month. $5 a month to feed and clothe each member of your family. And the average worker makes about $1.55 a day and $430 a year. So for those of you who are coin collectors, or you've ever seen those Morgan silver dollars that are minted in the 1870s and the 80s and the 90s, dollars, I mean, okay, a dollar is a dollar, but it was a really big deal back then if you're earning $1.55 a day. Next slide. And how about Florida? So we've seen the big picture, the United States. Let's go down and talk about what's happening here in Florida. Next slide. So today, about 21.5 million people in Florida. But look at the 1870s, the 80s, and the 90s. So a very, very, very different state. Next slide. And again, just to give you some look at where we are, Key West in relation to Cuba, the Gulf of Mexico, because we're going to talk about Key West now. Next slide. So prior to 1870, the population of Key West is Anglos, whites, and Bahamians. And it's really not till after 1870 that we begin to have this huge amount of immigration from Cuba. Next slide. And so as an aside here, immigration back in this period is really not an issue. I mean, there are just not enough people in the United States for anybody to worry about whether or not we have too many immigrants, because the issue really is we can't have too many immigrants. We need immigrants to come for the country to grow. And in fact, immigration is not a federal responsibility until 1875. And really the first Immigration Act, and this seems rather incredible given our discussions about immigration today, the federal government put a head tax of 50 cents on every immigrant who came to a U.S. port. But by the way, the Congress did pass a law and say, we don't want lunatics, we don't want convicts, and we don't want people likely to become a public charge. Next slide. But we really didn't talk about controlling immigration at the federal level until 1892, when the feds opened Ellis Island. It's the first federal immigration status. And this is important as we talk about who comes to Key West and who ends up living in Key West, because there's not much of a control on immigration. In fact, quite the contrary, our borders are very fluid and very porous. If I'm living in Cuba and I want to come to Key West, well, I just get on a boat and I come to Key West. And if I want to go back to Cuba, well, that's what I do. Next slide. So Key West is the very first city in Florida to surpass 10,000 residents. Today, our population here is about 25,000, Of course, very different in cities like Miami and Jacksonville, but you can see here that our competition back in the 70s and the 80s was Jacksonville, Florida. But Key West is the winner in 1890 with 18,000 residents here. Next slide. So what were they doing? Well, almost everyone who lives in Key West knows after a time that there was a big business in wrecking. And why is that? Well, because ships sailing from Cuba to Europe or into the Gulf of Mexico, say going to Mobile or going to New Orleans, maybe going to Pensacola, going to Galveston. If you're coming from Europe and you're crossing through the straits between the Keys and Cuba, well, maybe you don't have a chart and you're not really sure where Key West is. Very easy to run aground on the reefs. Also hurricanes. If you're caught in a storm or you're caught in a hurricane, you might run aground. You have to remember that there's not much in the way of railroads still, particularly after the Civil War, when railroads in the South have been very much disrupted. If you said, well, why don't I just land, for example, in Jacksonville and put my goods on railroads and they can cross over to, say, Mississippi or Alabama? Well, you can't do that because there aren't really any railroads up and running. So that's why everything is being brought around in ships. And when those ships wreck on the reefs, then they're salvaged. And this is how Key West residents are making a lot of money. In fact, you've probably heard the comment that at one time, Key West had the greatest per capita wealth in the country because of all the wrecking. Next slide. So again, if you look at the map here, you can see Key West down at the bottom of the map, and you can see that if you're coming around from Europe and you're rounding Florida on your way to Pensacola or Mobile, Galveston, New Orleans, if you make a mistake, easy to wreck, which obviously is why we have some lighthouses in Key West, right? Next slide. So eventually, and I talked about this a little bit just a couple of minutes ago, eventually railroads from Jacksonville and other places on the Atlantic seaboard reduced the need for ships carrying a lot of cargo, and that means fewer shipwrecks, which is why today, obviously, there's not much in the way of wrecking or salvage. But even in 1900 to 1910, there was still $330,000 worth in salvage because ships continued to wreck in Key West. Next slide. So there's the harbor of Key West in the late 19th century. Next slide. So what else are people doing in Key West? Cigars. So the reason that cigar manufacturing becomes so important in Key West is because originally the cigars were made in Cuba, where the tobacco leaves were being grown. But then in 1857, the U.S. imposes some import tariffs on cigars. And so the solution is, well, okay, we'll start making cigars in the U.S. and we'll just export the leaves because there's no tax on the leaves. So the Civil War intervenes in here from 1861 to 1865, but cigars become a really, really big business in Key West, driven primarily by this tax. Next slide. So look at this. 8,000 cigar workers by 1875. I mean, that's a huge amount of the population. It's a $10,000 a day industry, which is huge if you go back to my point that an average worker made $1.55 a day and $430 a year. So it's a huge industry here. Next slide. Key West Select cigars. Next slide. Some of you have probably seen this photograph. It's quite famous. It says Havana Cigars on it. Next slide. And here's a great picture of workers in the cigar industry in Key West. A lot of workers coming to Key West to roll the cigars. Where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from Cuba. A huge Cuban community here. Next slide. And the next thing that people are doing here is fishing. This is a huge industry, and the local fishermen have boats called smacks. And these smacks, and I'm not sure exactly where the name comes from, but they have a deep well in the middle of the boat that's filled with salt water, which means you can keep your fish alive until your boat returns to port. So you might be out for days fishing, but that's okay because you basically have this live area, live fishing water area where you can keep your fish. And this is a big industry in the 70s and the 80s, except, next slide, the Spanish government, which is running Cuba because it's part of the Spanish Empire, pretty much puts the Key West fishing industry, the smacks, out of business because of this 2.5 cents a pound tax on live fish. And as a result, most of these commercial fishermen who were selling their fish in Cuba sell their smacks to Cuban fishermen because they simply can't compete with the Cuban fishermen. Next slide. A very famous fisherman, Ernest, right? Ernest Hemingway. So fishing is still very popular and very important here. Commercial fishing certainly still exists, but a lot of sport fishermen, of which this guy was certainly one of our more famous. Next slide. Smuggling, a big, big business. Now, if you were talking about the 1970s or the 1960s, you might think about drug smuggling. But if you go back 100 years before that, not really a lot of drug smuggling. But what were they smuggling to Cuba and from Cuba? Next slide. Well, believe it or not, it was profitable to smuggle lard, butter, condensed milk, gunpowder, shoes, and some opium to Cuba. And then once the guerrillas, once the Cuban patriots begin to fight against Spanish rule, there is a lot of smuggling of arms and munitions for the insurrection. And the insurrection starts in the late 1860s and goes on for 30 years. Next slide. And what about from Cuba? Well, I did some research here, and believe it or not, they actually smuggled mail because you could make money rather than sending your letter from Cuba to the United States. If you put your letters in the hands of an American smuggler and they were then delivered in the US, it was possible to save money. And then the other thing that was being smuggled was sugar, coffee, cocoa, tropical fruits, and nuts from Cuba. Next slide. And some of you probably know that sugar was a huge export in Cuba and continues to be very important. When Castro was in power, the older Castro, sugarcane was still the huge export. And look at this, 1,500 sugar plantations, half of Cuba's cultivated land was sugarcane. And so this was a very, very valuable export to the United States. And it became very profitable to smuggle sugar from Cuba to the United States once some American sugar producers, particularly those who were producing sugar from sugar beets, began agitating for tariffs against Cuban cane sugar. So that's, again, a way to make money by smuggling. Next slide. Another view of Key West that some of you have probably seen, are very distinctive architecture. Next slide. So a big, big change then is the arrival of Cubans. And cigar industry workers are one of the reasons that Cubans arrive, but the other one is as a result of the 10 years war in Cuba. A lot of Cuban patriots opposed to Spanish rule decide to take up exile in the United States. Some of them are in New York, some of them are in Philadelphia, but quite a few in Key West. And again, I put in parentheses, laws governing immigration. Well, there's not much in the way of federal intervention or federal concern. And so Cubans who want to come to Key West simply do that. Next slide. So if we look at the population of Key West, remember I said that prior to 1870, it's whites, Anglos, and Bahamians, African Americans. But by 1885, the arrival of Cubans has really changed the demography of the island. So in 1885, about 34% of those living here are born here. But look at this, 575 are second generation Cuban, and then 32% of those living here are actually from Cuba who have emigrated. And then born in the Bahamas, black people, about 25%. Next slide. And again, if you look at this map, this really shows you why Key West is central to the arrival of Cubans, and also north of Cuba, the Bahamas. Many, many African Americans, black people, come from the Bahamas to Key West. And you can see the proximity is such on the map that this makes perfect sense. It's not too hard to get here. Next slide. So this is the second thing that I want to talk about. The first thing being the arrival of Cubans, but the second thing being the growth and the importance of the black population in Key West as a component of change. So prior to the Civil War, there were some enslaved people in Key West. Some were also free, but the remote location of Key West meant that there was not a slave auction house here, and all. There were some slaves. Really, the character of the island and the fact that it's a long way from the mainland meant that although slavery exists in the United States, doesn't have much of an impact on Key West, although there are enslaved people here who are freed at the end of the Civil War. Next slide. So in fact, probably you've seen this sign out at Higgs Beach about the African cemetery there, which is all a matter of a very sad story where African Americans who were enslaved died here and were buried out at Higgs Beach. Next time you're at Higgs, make sure you read the sign. Next slide. So the issue is, how did black people get to the Bahamas? Certainly some were enslaved, and the reason that it happened seems to be that after our own revolution, 1775, 1776, after the triumph of the revolutionaries, loyalists loyal to the crown, to the British crown, decided to move to the Bahamas. And we think about 5,000 to 7,000 actually evacuated, probably left from St. Augustine, that area, and they went to the Bahamas and they took their slaves with them. And in fact, at this particular time, black Bahamians outnumbered whites 3-1. Next slide. Yes. So the question is, did the 13th Amendment free only African Americans? Well, the amendment doesn't actually talk about African Americans. It simply says that servitude is abolished. So anyone who would have been enslaved is freed then by the 13th Amendment. And the other question is, weren't there a lot of white Bahamian families in Key West? Yes, there were. And again, these are the loyalists who've gone to the Bahamas, but again, come to Key West because there are economic opportunities in Key West that perhaps do not exist in the Bahamas. So I think that's exactly right, there are. But if we're talking about African Americans, the point I want to make is that black Bahamians came to Key West because you got higher wages and you were paid in cash. The land in the Bahamas is pretty poor for farming. It is, of course, possible to farm there, but black people, particularly after slavery ends in the British Empire, which it does before it does in America, there are black Bahamians who come over here because There's better fishing, better turtling, sponging, and higher wages paid in cash. Next slide. So this is not Key West, but it's an example of Florida Keys settlers who were from the Bahamas. Next slide. So early occupations, sure, fishing, sponging, there was salt manufacturing as well. And then later, cigar making, sponger, carpenter, laborer, these would be pretty typical. Next slide. And if you were an African-American female, and this is probably regardless of where you were in the United States, a predominant occupation would be a laundress or a seamstress. Next slide. So I think this is, if you figure that the United States as a whole, our African American, our black population is about 11% of the total population, and it's been fairly consistent there for many years now. But look at Key West here on our own island. 8,000 black Bahamians in Key West out of a total of about 25,000. Quite significant. Next slide. And so where did they live? Well, we're all familiar with Bahama Village, but at this particular time, a lot of African Americans living along Angela Street, Windsor Lane, by the cemetery, and in the vicinity of Eaton and Thomas. And there were a lot of these ethnic communities, if you want to call them that, in Key West, obviously the Cubans, black Bahamians, and some of these obviously survive, the most familiar to us being Bahama Village, although Bahama Village has certainly changed a lot over the years. Next slide. And again, just to show you the cemetery and Angela, and then Bahama Village, you can see down towards the south west. Next slide. And pretty familiar to anyone who's been down and gone through Bahama Village. Next slide. So this is a very, very famous landmark here in Key West, the African American Episcopal Church. Black church is very, very important in the black community, and no less so here in Key West. Next slide. That's the original structure. Here it is today, a familiar landmark. Next slide. It's on Whitehead, first erected in 1865, and then the current structure dates to 1902. Next slide. And what about schools? Well, no public schools in Key West until 1870. And then there's a Douglas colored school named after Frederick Douglass, a very famous figure in the African American community, visits Lincoln in the White House in the 1860s. And the Douglas Colored School is here in the 1870s, and then relocated in World War II to Emma, Petrine, Petronia, and Olivia. And everyone knows that schools were racially segregated right up through the middle of the 20th century. Next slide. And then the third change to talk about is the Great Fire of 1886. And apparently started in a cafe or in a saloon, argument over a card game, some shots are fired, a lamp is kicked over, it's 1:30 in the morning, and most of Key West burns. As I put here, it begins in a cafe apparently near San Carlos. Next slide. Destroyed warehouses full of tobacco. Majority of residents are unemployed. because they can't roll cigars. And so off they go to Tampa, at least the majority of the Cubans. Next slide. Here's the downtown Key West after the fire. You can see there's hardly anything left because most of the structures were wood. But next slide. 6 months later, almost everyone has returned to Key West. The town is rapidly rebuilding. Employment is back. And although you'd think this fire would have been absolutely devastating, and it was, 6 months later to a year later, everything is pretty much back to normal. Next slide. So the last thing I want to talk about is the nest of revolution. So Jose Marti, we could easily spend an hour or more just talking about his role in achieving independence and freedom for Cuba. And probably the most important thing to remember about Marti is that he is able to unify the Cuban emigres in Key West. And this really is the key to success. There are big Cuban populations in New York and other areas, but the proximity of Key West to Cuba, to Havana, and the huge Cuban population that's here making cigars is really, really, really important to the independence effort. Next slide. So we're all familiar with the Spanish-American War, 1898, but the struggle for Cuban independence starts a lot earlier. And there's a 10 years war that lasts from 1868 to 1878. And in this particular conflict, wealthy Cuban planters declare their independence from Spain. Cuba had very much developed its own unique culture and its own unique character, and Cubans felt that they really didn't have much in common with the Spanish Empire. Really no different than American colonials living here in the 1760s and 1770s, deciding that we really don't have much in common with the British anymore, and we have our own culture, we want to go our own way. So this is not unique to the Spanish Empire. The South American countries all have varying degrees of independence movements. Simón Bolívar being very, very famous, after whom Bolivia is obviously named. But Cuba is one of the last colonies in the empire. And here, as you might imagine, what is it that really triggers this? Taxation. Not only were the Spanish taxing the Cubans think excessively, but what a surprise, the other complaint is it's taxation without representation. Sound familiar? It's the same thing that American revolutionaries said in the 1760s and 1770s. And in this particular case, if you were Cuban, you were not allowed to participate in the government that was running Cuba. So there's a lot of resentment, and plus it's high taxes. So next slide. So the 10-year war is unsuccessful. Quite unsuccessful, about 200,000 dead. There's some reforms. One of the things that had really upset the Cubans was they wanted, the Cuban independence movement was they wanted the abolition of slavery. Slavery is still legal in Cuba at this time, and it's not until 1880 that it's actually disappears. I think formally it's not until 1885 that the Spanish crown actually abolishes slavery. So where does this bring in Jose Marti? Well, he's actually born in Cuba in 1859, I think. Next slide. Here he is. Actually born in Cuba. And he becomes very, very energized by the Cuban independence movement. He's very much an intellectual. And he gets in trouble. He's only 16 years old, but he gets in trouble when he writes a letter reproving a friend who had joined the Spanish army. And the Spanish government in Cuba is so upset about this letter and its criticism of the Spanish army that 16-year-old Martí is tried for treason. He's convicted, and he's sentenced to jail for 6 years. So his mother tries to get him freed or some sort of commutation of the sentence, saying, look, he's only 16 years old, he's still a juvenile, but the Spanish won't relent, and he goes to prison. But after a couple of years, he has some very bad infections on his legs because of the chains that he's having to wear. And so he's released for a time, and then the Spanish government exiles him to Spain. Well, as you might imagine, this only redoubles Martí's belief that independence is the only future for Cuba. And so he travels widely in South America, in Mexico, and Guatemala, eventually winds up in Key West. Next slide. In January 1892, he's in Key West. And Key West is extremely important because the cigar makers, the cigar workers have money. And they provide the funding for the revolution, for the struggle. And it's here in the San Carlos, which is very famous and which we all familiar with there along Duval Street. It's there that Martí builds his Cuban Revolutionary Party, and this then is the beginning of the struggle, the last struggle that does end up being coming to independence in 1898. Next slide. Cigar workers. They've got the money. If you're going to have a revolution, you've got to have money to buy arms, to buy munitions. Next slide. Again, this should be familiar to everybody, the San Carlos. Next slide. So Martí returns to Cuba along with the other revolutionaries, launching the revolution, the final struggle for independence, in April of 1895. It's not really going all that well. Next slide. Here he is in his uniform as a revolutionary officer. Great mustache. Next slide. And he's killed in action. He's only 42 years old, but he's killed in action against the Spanish troops. The revolutionaries have some success, but what really brings it all to the end is the destruction of the USS Maine in the harbor in 1898. The entry of the United States into the war is a war against Spain, and that's then what finally brings the revolutionaries the success that they want, which is the end of Spanish rule in Cuba. Next slide. Okay, so the question here is, was Cuban independence supported by the U.S.? There's a lot of public support for the revolutionaries. There are many, many stories about how the revolutionaries have suffered and how brutal the Spanish have been in suppressing the revolution and the guerrillas. Officially, the United States government does not take a position, but as I think you probably know, William Randolph Hearst and the Hearst newspapers really are pushing and pushing for war, and it's eventually too much for the United States, and we do enter the war. So was Cuban independence supported by the United States? By a vast majority of the public, yes. Next slide. And here he is, Jose Marti, very, very, very famous in Cuba today, certainly considered to be the father of Cuban independence, a great patriot, a great intellectual. Again, we could spend a lot of time talking about Marti. Next slide. So, in conclusion, we like to think today that we have seen a lot of change, and we have. We have seen a lot of change. But think about the change that you saw in Key West in the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s. Changes in your economy, a civil war that devastated a plantation slave-based economy in the South and has now disappeared. And then the demographic changes. Next slide. And the revolution in Cuba. So a lot of changes in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and it would have been exciting to live back then, but I think it's okay to be alive now. Next slide. Okay, questions, comments? Anything?
Go ahead and type them into the text box on the right-hand side of your screen if you're on a computer, and then I believe it is on the bottom screen if you are on a tablet or cell phone. Give them a couple more seconds.
There must be some question out there. Who would play Jose Marti if we made a movie? Would it be Brad Pitt or George Clooney? What do you think?
Oh, hold on just a moment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and send these. Lots of thank yous.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a question for you.
Tom Hanks, okay. Okay.
I think there was...
Anything else?
Oh, here, hold on. There's one for you. Okay.
Didn't Jose Marti speak outside of where La Di Da is? You know, I don't know. Probably. I think he was speaking all over Key West. But I think that's probably true, but I don't know. Good question.
All right. Thank you so much, Fred.
You're welcome.
And we will see you very soon.
We'll see you on January 21st.
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Have a great evening, everybody. And thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
Good night.